8, where we will start. Well, we'll get to in a minute. Get my notes up. Well, first of all, I just kind of want to remind us where we are. We're in the book of Matthew. If you remember, Matthew is really written to the Jewish community, and it really was about proving that Jesus is the Messiah, that Jesus is God. And so I actually want to take you all the way back to chapter 1. For those of you who have a Bible, you can just flip through if you want, or just listen. It doesn't matter. Just want to kind of remind you what we've been through to get to chapter 8. In chapter 1, it really begins with the genealogy of Christ, and this is really to show kind of the legal bearing for him being the Son of God, showing his genealogy leading up to both Mary and Joseph, and then we look at the birth of Christ in chapters 1 and chapter 2, which is really about the prophetic qualifications, if you will. So if the genealogy is about the legal qualifications, then the prophecy around his birth is the prophetic qualifications. Then in chapter 3, we see the baptism of Christ, which is really the divine approval of who he is, right? The divine authority, if you will, kind of set on who he is. And then in chapter 4, we get to the temptations of Christ, which is really about his spiritual qualifications. And then finally, in chapters 5 through 7, we have the sermon, which is really the theological qualifications, if you will. So at the end of chapter 7, you'll remember from last week, it ends with this in verses 28 and 29. Let's just read it again. As and so it was when Jesus had ended these sayings that the people were astonished at his teachings, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. So it leaves us with this question at the end of the people being blown away, right, by his teaching, by what he says. And they've got to be asking the question, by what authority does he say these things? Who does he think he is anyway? Right? And really what we come to then from Matthew 8 really through Matthew 12 is the laying down of that authority. In other words, it's the statements that say, this is God that's speaking to you. And we're going to prove that through some of the things that he is doing. So it really is for those people who come down out of the mountain. We'll talk about them in a little bit, but it's really laying down his credentials. It's a series of miracles, really from chapter 8 to chapter 12, that lay down the credentials as the Messiah. They point to his deity. What's really fascinating is, they spend 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 with these miracles pointing to his deity, showing that he's the Messiah. And then when you get to chapter 12, you look at the reaction of the Jews, and their reaction is, oh, this must be the devil, right? These things must come from Beelzebub. And it's just one of those head plant, things you go, are you guys kidding me? After all that he has shown you to show you that he is God, your response is that he's the devil. It's just again showing the way that the Satan just messes with people's minds. Even with all of these miracles being shown to them, their response could be that. All of them are supposed to be attesting to his deity. They're supernatural. I want to actually start today, actually not in Matthew. I want to start in the Gospel of John. So you'll flip there for a minute. I want to look at several places in John. Now, John, if you remember, is really written to a broader audience than just Jews. It's written to Jews and Gentiles. It's really written to kind of folks who have heard the message once, but this is kind of giving them the more depth into the message. So in Gospel of John, I'm just going to pull out some different pieces here to show you the general truth that we're trying to get across. So in chapter 1, verse 14, a familiar verse, right? It says, and the word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as to the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. So when you see the words, we beheld his glory, you shouldn't just think of that as, well, this is some kind of bright light shining around his head, right? They're really saying there, we beheld him as the glorified one. We beheld him as deity. We beheld him as supernatural. We beheld him as just something beyond human. We beheld his glory, that he was just amazing beyond human understanding. And it really begins then to talk about what he did on earth, that people said, this is not normal. This is not a normal human. Look then at Gospel of John, chapter 5. And Jesus begins to talk about this. Chapter 5, verse 19. Gospel of John, chapter 5, verse 19. Mine says, then Jesus answered and said to them, most assuredly I say to you, the Son can do nothing of himself, but what he has seen the Father do. But for whatever he does, the Son also does in like manner. For the Father loves the Son and shows him all things that he himself does, and he will show him greater works than these, that you may marvel. For as the Father raises the dead and gives life to them, even so the Son gives life to whom he wills, etc. And it goes on, right? But the point here is, go back to verse 19, but what he sees the Father do, for whatever he does, the Son also does in the like manner. So he's saying there that what you're seeing me do is what the Father does. The miracles that you're seeing me do are what the Father can do. Only the Father can do the things that I'm doing. He's laying out the fact that these things that he's doing, these miracles that he's performing, is proof that he is the Father, of the Father, that the Father is in him. All of those statements, right? And he's saying that here. Look down to verse 36, same chapter 5, verse 36. He's saying, but I have a greater witness than John, talking about John the Baptist. For the works which the Father has given me to finish, the very works that I do, bear witness to me that the Father has sent me. So again, he's saying the works that I do, the only way that you could understand them is for you to understand that the Father has sent me. Skip then to chapter 10, still in John, chapter 10. Verse 25. 10:25 says, Jesus answered them, I told you, and you do not believe. The works that I do in my Father's name, they bear witness to me. So he's saying there to them, I guess we could read 26 also, but you do not believe because you are not of my sheep, as I said to you. But he's saying to them, you don't believe the words that I say to you, at least believe the miracles, at least believe the works that I do, that they're done in my Father's name. If you don't believe what I'm saying, listen to what I'm doing and believe on that. And he again says the same thing down in verse 36, same chapter 10:36. Says, do you say of him whom the Father sanctified is sent into the world, you are blaspheming, because he said, I am the Son of God. If I do not do the works of my Father, do not believe me. But if I do, though you do not believe me, believe the works, that you may know and believe that the Father is in me and I in him. So again, he's saying, even if you don't believe what I'm saying, you've got to believe what I'm doing. You've got to believe these miracles. And in chapter 14, still in the Gospel of John, chapter 14, verse 10, again, saying the same thing. Do you not believe that I am the Father? I am in the Father, and the Father in me. The words that I speak to you, I do not speak in my own authority, but the Father who dwells in me does the works. Believe me that I am in the Father, and the Father in me, or else believe me for the sake of the works themselves. So this is, again, why we have 4 chapters in Matthew talking about his miracles, talking about his works. He fundamentally believed that people wouldn't just get it based upon what he was saying, that he would have to show these miracles to show that he was in the Father, that the things that Bless you. That the things that he was doing were based upon those works. So one more thing in John, go to the end of the book, chapter 20. Chapter 20, verse 30. Where John lays out why he has written this book. In chapter 20, verse 30, it says, and truly Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you may believe in Jesus as the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. So again, these miracles, the reason we're talking about miracles, the reason we're going to spend a lot of time about miracles, was all about showing that Jesus is the Christ, that he's the Messiah, that he's the Son of God, that the Father is in him, that he came on behalf of the Father, all of those things. All right, now, as I said, there's a bunch of miracles in chapters 8 through 12. I want to talk first about all about the first three. Today we're just going to deal with one of them, but let me talk in general about the first three miracles. The first three miracles are all about physical things. They're about physical illness, right? He begins at the kind of the lowest level of human need about the physical. He then turns to the spiritual later on, but he first talks about the physical. Second thing I'll say is that he in all three of these cases, he responds to an appeal by someone. We see the leper coming to him. We see the Gentile coming to him. We see the woman coming to him. So you see here the compassion of Christ as he responds to people who have needs, and he responds to those needs with compassion. The other thing that will become very clear as we get into it, in fact, look down at verse 3, chapter 8, verse 3. And Jesus put out his hand and touched him, saying, I am willing, be cleansed. We'll see in each case that he does these things based on his own will, right? He's sovereign. He decides, I'm going to do this miracle. I'm going to heal this person based on his decision. It's not something that's forced on him. It's not something that someone else has said he had to do. He decides, it's his will, and he makes that decision. The other thing just to recognize is that well, let me just say it. He touches people here that are at the lowest level of the Jewish society, right? You see first the leper, and then you see a Gentile, and then you see a woman. All three of these groups at the lowest level of the Jewish society, certainly the lowest level of the Pharisaical society at this point in time, and that he pays attention to them first. These are his first miracles that he gets into, is really kind of a fascinating statement that he's trying to make about the people that he's ministering to. All right, so those are just kind of general comments about these miracles. Now I want to get into this first miracle, but to do it, I need to set it up, which really comes back in chapter 4. Go back to chapter 4. Before we get into the sermon, we need to see what was Jesus doing before he paused and gave this great sermon on the Mount. So if you go back to chapter 4, verse 23, let's look at the paragraph right before we get into the sermon. So Matthew 4:23, it says, and Jesus went about all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, preaching and the gospel of the kingdom, and healing all kinds of sicknesses and all kinds of disease among the people. Then his fame went throughout all Syria, and they brought to him all sick people who were afflicted with various diseases and torments, and those who were demon-possessed, epileptics, paralytics, and he healed them. Great multitudes followed him from Galilee, from the Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and beyond the Jordan. So we see this is a continuation of that. There's a continuation of his ministry that's going on. He's teaching, he's preaching, and he's healing all throughout this whole area, the Decapolis, the 10 cities really around the Sea of Galilee that he has been working. So he's going back to that now. He's given the sermon. He's going back to the work of these miracles and healings that he really had been doing beforehand. All right, so now let's look at chapter 8 finally, verses 1 through 4. Let me read them and then we'll dive in. So chapter 8, verse 1, when he had come down from the mountain, great multitudes followed him. And behold, a leper came and worshipped him, saying, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Then Jesus put out his hand and touched him, saying, I am willing, be cleansed. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. And Jesus said to him, see that you tell no one, but go your way, show yourself to the priest, and offer the gift that Moses commanded as a testimony to them. All right, so let's go back to verse 1. When he had come down from the mountain, great multitudes followed him. So what's the mountain that's being talked about here? This is not a trick question. What mountain was he on? We don't know what mountain he was on, but he was on the mountain where he was preaching the sermon, right? It's the Sermon on the Mount. It's that sermon mountain, whatever that mountain is. Sorry, that may have been too tricky. It's the Sermon on the Mount. He was on that mountain. It was a high place. It may have just been a hill, right? A place where he was standing so the crowds could get to him. He comes down from that hill or mountain at this point in time. And it says, and great multitudes followed him. Now, I am curious, who were these multitudes? Who were the multitudes that were following him?
Well, we know some were the lowest of the people you just talked about. Was the leper man was there?
The leper was there, yeah. Who else was in this multitude?
I think it was just a cross section of the population. There was a lot of word of mouth about this man Jesus, who was saying things that nobody had ever heard before. So it was almost like a pop culture thing.
Were these all saved people?
Oh, no.
They were in need of healing, physical, spiritual, the demon possessed, all of them.
Yeah. Yeah, so I just wanted to make sure you're aware of that, right? So this multitude that came down is, as both of you have said, is kind of just a mixture of the people there at the time. It's the same people that were listening to the sermon, right? There was a mixture of folks that were disciples. There were those that were saved. There were those that were unsaved. It was just a broad group of people that come down. It's frankly the people that were amazed, right? The people at the end of chapter 7 that when they heard his speaking were amazed. They just continue to follow him. They don't know who this guy is. They don't know what's going on, but they want to see more, and they just follow him down the mountain. Now, let's go to verse 2. It says, and behold, a leper came and worshipped him, saying, Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. Now, the first thing you got to notice is the word behold, and we've talked about this word before. It's one of those shocking words. It's one, and it doesn't sound so shocking to us anymore. But when Matthew would say it, it would be, behold, or like, watch out, holy cow, whatever shocking word you want to put in there. He was freaked out by what he was seeing. What is to come is kind of a freaked out statement. And the first part of that is behold, a leper came and worshipped him, right? This leper, that the leper would come, that the leper would approach someone would be freaky. That would be crazy. They would not do this. No way would a leper come and approach people. We need to spend a minute and talk about leprosy. So I need you to go all the way back to Leviticus chapter 13. There's a lot written about leprosy in the Bible, but the legal stuff about leprosy really is here in Leviticus chapters 13 and 14. Now, I'm not going to read all of chapters 13 and 14 because the details are excruciating, but I do want to read a little bit of it so you get a feel for what's going on here. So Leviticus chapter 13, verse 1, it says, "And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, When a man has on his skin of his body a swelling, a scab, or a bright spot, and it becomes on the skin of his body like a leprous sore, then he shall be brought to Aaron and the priest, or one of the sons of the priest. The priest shall examine the sore of the skin of the body. If the hair of the sore is turned white, and the sore appears to be deeper than the skin of the body, it is a leprous sore. Then the priest shall examine him and pronounce him unclean. But if the bright spot is white of the skin of the body, and does not appear to be deeper than the skin, and his hair is not turned white, then the priest shall isolate the one who has the sore for 7 days. And the priest shall examine him the 7th day. If indeed the sore appears, blah, 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 blah. I mean, it just goes on. If it turns white, then wait 3 more days, then wait 7 more days, then check him back a little bit later. So there was a lot of discussion about this leprosy and how you knew whether a person had leprosy or not, right? Then you go all the way over, still in chapter 13, go to verses 45 and 46. So Leviticus 13:45. Now the leper on whom the sore is, his clothes shall be torn, his head bare, and he shall cover his mustache and cry, unclean, unclean. He shall be unclean. All the days he has the sore, he shall be unclean. He is unclean. He shall dwell alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. So once they go through all this determination in chapter 13 about whether the person is leprous or not, once they determine that he is, this person gets his clothes torn, his head shaved, he's got to cover his mustache, and he's got to cry out, unclean, unclean, all the days of his life. At any time that he approaches someone, he's got to let them know that he is unclean, that he is leprous. He's got to live outside the camp. He's got to dwell by himself. Typically, they dwelled in caves outside of Jerusalem, and they were not allowed to get near anyone. If you got within 6 feet, it's interesting that it's 6 feet. If you got within 6 feet of a leper, then you were also unclean, and you had to go through a cleansing ceremony. Oh, by the way, if the wind was blowing, then it was 100 feet that you couldn't get within a leper. But normally it was just 6 feet. If you went into the house where a leper was, you were unclean. If you walked down the street where a leper has walked, you were unclean. If you touched any of the things that a leper touched, you were unclean, and you had to get cleansed. So this life that the leper lived was one of total exclusion. Now, what was leprosy? There's a lot of conversation and discussion about what leprosy was. Most folks today believe it was what we now call Hansen's disease. It's a scaly skin disease, if you will, probably which comes from some kind of bacteria. It attacks typically it starts in the face, starts with sores on the face, then it goes throughout the rest of the body. It attacks also the nervous system such that the person no longer has sense of pain. They lose feeling in particularly in their extremities, and so as a result, they injure themselves very easily. They don't know when they have gotten hurt. They can rub actually the skin right off of their hands and arms not knowing that they're rubbing it so hard. Eventually the disease gets so bad that they begin to start losing fingers and toes. They can lose a hand, part of an arm, a foot is not unusual when these get to extreme cases. It's and people can have this for 20, 30, 40 years, right? It's a very slow, agonizing death. And in fact, the Jews considered these people dead. They did not have any property rights. It was a pretty abysmal existence, right? So they've got to live out of town. They've got to live in these caves. They're not allowed to interact with anybody. They've got to tell everybody they're unclean as they come to them. Oh, and the other thing was that the Pharisees told them the reason they had these disease was because of sin in their life. So obviously they were seen as sinners, and they were sent out. So again, when for this leper to approach Jesus in the midst of this crowd would just be a crazy thing. Would not be a normal thing at all. They would be staying away from people. They certainly would not be in a crowd. They certainly would not be approaching someone. So that he did this would be a very unusual thing. So behold. Behold, a leper came. Now, I want to talk about the leper and his attitude and the way that he approaches Jesus is very, very important. So the first thing I want to say about him is there's no question that as a leper, he knew he was a leper, right? This was not oh, I'm a leper? I didn't know that, right? He's been living for years in this state. He understands he's a leper. He's crying, unclean, unclean. He knows that he is loathsome to the people. They don't want to look at him. They don't want to interact with him. He also believes that he's a terrible sinner, right? He's got this disease because he's a sinner. He knew he brings nothing to the table when he thinks about approaching Jesus at this point. He's got nothing. He knows he's in a terrible state. So that's the first thing. The second thing, however, though, is that you see that he comes to Christ with incredible confidence and dependence upon Christ. He realizes that no one can do anything for him. The Pharisees, they agreed that they could do nothing for him. There was nothing that they could do. There's no forgiveness that they could grant. There's no way that they could, because you got to realize that the Pharisees in those days were also kind of thought of as the doctors, as the physicians, right? So people had to go to them when they had these kinds of sicknesses, as it talked about in Deuteronomy. So, and there was nothing that they could do for him other than send him out. So his confidence and his dependence on Christ is pretty amazing that he would come to Christ for this. Now, the second thing, or third thing, wherever I am, is, look at what it says here. It says, behold, the leper came and worshiped him, saying, Lord. The leper came and worshiped him. The reverence that the leper has as he approaches Christ is again pretty amazing. In Mark and Luke, when they talk about this same event, it says that he either fell on his knees or fell on his face, right? Worshiping him. This word worship, we've talked about it before, but this word worship is kind of unusual in Scripture. It's only used when someone is worshiping God, worshiping the gods, right? This word worship was always set aside for the worship of God. And so when it says here that the leper came worshiping him, he was worshiping God. By the way, the last time we see anybody coming to Jesus and worshiping him, do you remember when that was?
The wise men?
The wise men, yeah. That's and it's the same word that they used, right? They used this word worship when they came down and worshiped Christ as an infant. This is the next time that we see anybody worshiping Christ is now this leper. It's kind of an incredible connection. I am wondering, how does this leper know to worship Jesus? How does he know? Any thoughts on that?
I think maybe he understands how sinful he is. And so when you understand how sinful you are, you recognize holiness immediately, And so therefore he knew. I mean, he may have heard and that's what prompted him to go, but when he was there, he knew. Does that make sense?
No, I like that a lot, Karen. I like that a lot. I like the way you said that a lot, because I think that I was going to say similar things, but not as well as you did. Yeah, his recognition of his sinfulness, as we've said, his knowledge right up front, opened him up to hear and to see and to understand who this was. And he falls down and worships him. So, no, I'm always amazed by who hears and who doesn't hear, who listens and who doesn't listen, right? And I think that the connecting it back to him understanding his own situation, right? And we'll see this in the as we look at the other miracles too. Those people who came to him, they understood their own situation, and they weren't trying to put on a false front. They weren't trying to solve it in some other way. They'd come to the end of their rope, and then they bowed down and worshiped. So it's pretty amazing. The other thing I'll say is that you'll notice again that the first thing he does is worship him. The first thing he does is not to say, "Hey, Jesus, good buddy, old pal, I'm a leper. Could you do something about this?" No, the first thing he does is worship. This should take us right back to the Lord's Prayer, right? The first thing we should do is worship. The first thing we should do is, "Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done," right? This is what the leper does. He comes and worships the Lord. He comes and worships, calling him Lord, before he ever does anything about asking him what he needs. It's, again, an amazing pattern for us. All right. So in that, the other thing that you also see, you see his reverence, but then you also see his humility, right? Because he says, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." He doesn't come in and say, "Jesus, I need you to make me clean. I think you ought to make me clean. Why have you not made me clean? Why did you put me in this situation?" You don't see him complaining about his sickness, his illness. You don't see him demanding healing. He submits himself to God's sovereignty. Let me say that again. He submits himself to God's sovereignty. He's saying, "If you will." Now, let me ask this question. If Jesus was not willing to heal the leper, what would have been his response?
Jesus' response or the leper's response?
The leper's response. If Jesus was not willing to heal him, what would his response have been?
I think he would have been okay with it.
Yeah, total acceptance.
Because he knew he didn't have to do it, and, I mean, we see that happen all the time with people. Some people get healed, some don't, but.
Yeah, because he knew he didn't deserve it.
Well, just by the way he approached Jesus, it was clear that he was, like you said, he wasn't demanding, he wasn't asking, he just said, "If it's your will, you can do it."
Yeah, and the other thing I'll remind you is that he worshiped first, right? Right? He worshiped first. To me, this is again why, when we went over the Lord's Prayer, that's so critically important to worship first, such that whether Jesus answers his prayer, answers his request or not, he was there to worship. It was all about the Lord's will. It was all about what God wanted to do, rather than what the man wanted. He said, "Listen, if you're willing, you can do this, but I'm going to leave that up to you. God, it's up to you. You decide. You're sovereign. You're the boss." The other thing you got to realize in the midst of this is the lepers connection to his sin, right? He's thinking, I am a gross sinner because I've got leprosy, right? So he's really asking him to forgive him of his sin, right? So this is again, while, he's saying, Lord, if you're willing to forgive my sin and therefore cleanse me and therefore heal me of this leprosy, right? It's up to you. Can you really forgive my sin? Is that even possible? I'm obviously a gross sinner because I've got leprosy. So it's an amazing approach for this man to come to him and say, first of all, to worship him as Lord, and then say, hey, if you're willing, because I know how bad I am, I know how terrible I am, I know in what a terrible state I am in. If you're willing, right? Okay. Now, the next, so humility, clearly. The next thing, however, is obviously his faith, right? I mean, again, he says, if you're willing, you can make me clean. You can do it. You have the power. He knows that the Pharisees don't have the power, right? He knows there's nobody else who has the power, but amazingly, he knows that Jesus has the power. Now, it could be, as was said earlier, because, back in chapter 4, he'd already been healing others. This is the first case we see of anyone being healed of leprosy. There's only one other time in the Bible, and that goes all the way back to the Old Testament. Remember, there was a king named Naaman who was cured of leprosy by Elisha back in 2 Kings chapter 5. So this is the first time that we see Jesus healing a leper. He does heal other lepers later, but this is the first time that we have seen it. So it's kind of amazing that it's amazing that he believes Jesus has the power to do this. It shows a faith that is off the charts. It's interesting, the comparison between his humility and his faith, right? The humility in that I'm not sure you're willing to do this because of who I am, because of my sin, because of your sovereignty, and you decide. But at the same time, I know that you can do it. I believe that you have that ability and that power. He says, if you will it, it will be. Right? If you will it, if you are willing, you can make me clean. If you will it, it will happen. The response of we're going to come back to this in a few minutes, but the response of this leper in the midst of the situation he was in to Christ is just powerful. All right, let's look at verse 3. Let's look at the end of the story, and then we're going to wrap back around a minute. Then Jesus put out his hand and touched him, saying, I am willing, be cleansed. Immediately his leprosy was cleansed. So Jesus reaches out his hand and touches him. And in the notes of the play that is written here, it says to the crowd, and the whole crowd gasped, right? If this was a play, the whole crowd that's around him would just be shocked that he would touch this man. First of all, you got to think about, this man comes up to Jesus, and I can see a parting of the crowd as they're all getting 6 feet away from this leper, right? The whole crowd just moves backwards as this leper approaches. And then he comes to Jesus, he falls down before him, he worships him, he makes this statement, and then Jesus reaches out and touches him. It's just, behold. It's just behold. The other thing you got to realize is this man has probably not been touched in years, right? No one has touched him. No one has reached out to him. It's fascinating. In Mark, again, where this where this story is told again, it says that Jesus was moved with compassion and touched him, right? The compassion that he had for this man just flows out. By the way, did Jesus have to touch him to heal him?
No.
No, right? He didn't have to, but he did. He did. He did out of compassion, because this man needed to be touched, because it was important that Jesus show that picture. The other thing I see, I don't know, maybe this comes out of watching too much Superman pictures or something. I see Jesus touching this man and power emanating out of his hand into that man's body, right? I mean, you just see like a colorful spectrum of light going through this man's body as Jesus's power just moves into him and starts beginning to cleanse this leprosy. Because, you know, one thing that's interesting is that when we talk about God and his holiness, we often say, you know, God cannot be in the presence of unholiness, right? That in heaven there is no unholiness, there is no unrighteousness. But here you see God touching uncleanness. And so there's a part of the story again where the crowd just gasps that if we believe that this is the Messiah or God, there's no way he can touch uncleanness. But again, in my mind, he's not touching uncleanness, because the instant he touches that man becomes clean because of the power that emanates out of Jesus. It had to be, you know, he eradicated all uncleanness as he touched that man. So it was not God touching uncleanness. It was God touching cleanness because he made it clean.
Hey, Rich.
Yeah.
I think it's really neat how all those things you said about him, his worship, his faithfulness, all these things, Jesus never had to ask him anything. He didn't ask him any questions. He could feel it. He could know how this man felt. And he just did it.
Yeah. 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 It's a great statement.
But it almost has to be that he heard the sermon and he listened to the Lord's Prayer and he did exactly that. I mean, there's no way he would have come to Jesus and approached him that way if he hadn't just heard the sermon.
He heard the sermon and then he put it in practice, right? Which is not like most of us. We hear the sermon and go, wow, that was a really nice sermon. He heard the sermon and he actually put it in practice. Wow. You know, look at Jesus's response again, right? He says, I am willing, be cleansed. He touched him, and then he says, I am willing, be cleansed. I will it. I will it to be that you are cleansed. I mean, the power of Christ in that statement is just wow. I will it. Again, he didn't have to touch him. He could have just said, I will it, you're cleansed. And the guy became cleansed. He's immediately healed. He's immediately cleansed. You know, I just see this picture that Hollywood could not ever do right? Of this man where these scales begin to turn to back up. It's interesting if you go back and look at the story of Naaman back in the Old Testament I mentioned earlier. It says that his skin turned to the skin of a baby, right? That beautiful soft skin of an infant. It said Naaman's skin turned back to that, and you see that picture here where you have this man whose skin has been ravaged by sores and boils and flaking skin just ripping off. All of a sudden, it turns to baby-like skin. The other thing is that, assuming this man has had this disease for a long time, he's lost fingers, toes, maybe hands, right? All of a sudden, fingers start reappearing. A hand starts growing, right? God is creating fingers. God is creating toes. This is showing Jesus as the creator in this healing of leprosy. It's an incredibly powerful picture. As he heals him immediately, everything is cleansed, everything is healed, everything is back to the way it was before. I want you to go ahead.
I can't remember where I heard or read this, but, and I'm sure you'll get into it when we hit the spiritual aspect of it. But becoming a Christian as an adult, it was hard to, it seemed like you could hide your sin from Jesus initially. You know what I'm saying? It's just, it's one of those things where this picture, this physical picture, if you picture yourself with the sores as your sins, instead of hiding out in the cave or just presenting some of your sins to Jesus for forgiveness, you could actually, you physically can mentally in your mind put yourself covered in your sins, approaching Jesus for that full cleansing, that full recreation, the eradicating. It's like a physical picture of, instead of sores on a leper, but yourself with your sins. And then understanding your sinfulness and being in the presence of the holiness of Jesus and the ability of what he can do, because it is unbelievable. I think the older you are as an adult too, the more sin you think you've built up that can't be forgiven. So I think it's, I don't know, somewhere along the lines in my late 20s, I ran across something that represented that, and I can't remember who it was, but I thought that was a good, it just reminded me of it as you were talking about it, a good representation of how we come to Jesus, especially saved as an adult. So I don't want to scare kids too much, you know, but I mean.
Yeah, so I'm gonna talk about that in just a few minutes, Karen. But that's a great intro to it. So thank you for that. That's good. I do want to deal with verse 4 before I do that though. So let's look at verse 4. Oh wow, look what time it is. How could it possibly be that time? All right, I'll tell you what. let's leave verse 4 and let's go exactly to what Karen said, because that I want to make sure you get that before we leave here today. So not only is this an amazing miracle for this leper, it's also an important parable about sin, right? It's an important parable about salvation. So if you go back to what we said was the character of this leper, it's got to be the character of a person who's coming to Christ, a character of the person who wants to be saved. What did I say the first thing was? They have to understand that they're a leper, right? They have to understand that they are covered in sin, as Karen so greatly described it. Right, this knowledge of, which takes us right back to poor in spirit, right? The knowledge that we are a sinner, the knowledge that we are unclean, the knowledge that we don't bring anything to the table has got to be the first thing. Then the second thing is coming to Christ, knowing that he's the only one who can do anything about this. He's the only one that can save us from our sins, right? And then coming with reverence, worshiping him, recognizing that he is Lord, that he is God, that he has the power, coming to him with humility, right? If you will, you can save me. If you will have mercy on me for my sins, you can save me. You can provide for me. And then finally having the faith to say, you can do it, God. You can, even though I have all of this leprous sin about me, you can make me clean. You have the power, you have the ability, you have the and if you're willing, you can make me clean. And then the amazing thing is Jesus comes down and touches us. The crowd gasps to see that why in the world would he do that to us, right? Because he's moved with compassion. And he says, I will make you clean. I will forgive your sins. And immediately we are healed. of sin. Immediately, we are righteous in God's eyes. Immediately, he creates in us a new heart, right? Now, when we look at verse 4, and I'll just cover it as we talk through this. What are we supposed to do? He said, go to the priest, do what Moses has said to you, right? He's telling them to obey, which is exactly what we dealt with at the end of chapter 7, right? How do you prove your salvation? You prove it through obedience. And then he essentially says, I want you to be a testimony. I want your life to be a testimony. I want the priests to see it. I want them to understand what has happened. And I want your life then to be a testimony to the priests, to the rest of the people. So here's the problem, I think, and it goes right back to what Karen was saying a minute ago. You have been cured of leprosy, but you're still acting like someone who has leprosy. You have been cured of sin, but you're still acting like someone who has not been cured of sin. You're still sinning. You're still acting like a leper. You're not living out the testimony of being forgiven for sin.
Do you think that's because we don't separate out that when we're forgiven of sin, we're also forgiven of the guilt of the sin? And so we choose to carry the guilt? Or why do you think that is what I'm asking.
I think we've been living that it's way more comfortable to be a leper. The whole world is a bunch of lepers, right? And if I'm like a leper, then I'm going to fit in with the crowd. All of us lepers stick together. All of us sinners stick together. All of us worldly ones stick together. I'm not sure I want to be cleansed. I want to be different from the world. I want to stick out. I think that's what most of it is.
Our misery is what you're saying?
Yeah. We love complaining. We love griping. All right. Any other thoughts on this one? I do want you to ponder the parable here because I think it's everything that goes on in here is a parable for us living this Christian life. So it's important. All right, then, prayer request. Turn off the recording. Joanne.
For a safe trip down to South Carolina to be with the family for Thanksgiving, and just that all will go well.